8 people, 6 children, 1 blood-soaked house. Mary Peckham knocked on her neighbor's door that Monday morning, wondering why the Moore family hadn't started their chores. The chickens hadn't been fed. The curtains remained drawn. What she discovered inside would become America's most haunting, unsolved mass murder. Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, arrived minutes later. He pushed open the door to the guest bedroom first. 2 small forms lay motionless in the bed, the Stillinger sisters, ages 12 and 8. Then he saw the blood. By the time he reached the master bedroom, Ross Moore understood. His brother's entire family was gone. Every mirror in the house had been covered, every window blocked from inside, and somewhere in the darkness of the previous night, a killer had vanished into Iowa farmland, leaving behind a mystery that 112 years later remains unsolved. To understand what happened in Villisca, you need to understand what it was in 1912. 2,039 people called this southwestern Iowa town home. The Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad ran through Main Street. 3 newspapers, 2 banks, one devastating night that would define it forever. June 9, 1912 was Children's Day at the Presbyterian Church. Sarah Moore had coordinated the program. Her children would be performing. The evening was warm, humid, the kind of Iowa summer night where families gathered on porches and children caught fireflies in mason jars. The Moore family walked the 3 blocks home around 9:30 p.m., their voices carrying through the quiet streets. But here's what changes everything. The Stillinger sisters weren't supposed to be there. Lena and Ina Stillinger had planned to stay with their grandmother. Last minute, Sarah Moore invited them to sleep over. That spontaneous decision would cost them their lives. Before they became victims, they were people. Josiah B. Moore, 43 years old. Sarah Montgomery Moore, 39. They'd built something remarkable in Villisca, not just a family, but a future. Josiah ran a successful implement store, selling farming equipment to half the county. He served on the city council. Sarah taught Sunday school. They were, by every measure of 1912 Iowa, living the American dream. Herman Montgomery Moore, 11 years old, loved baseball. Mary Catherine Moore, 10, played piano. Arthur Boyd Moore, 7, collected marbles. Paul Vernon Moore, 5, had just learned to write his name. These weren't just names in a true crime story. These were children who went to sleep after a church program, in their own beds, in what should have been the safety of their home. Someone was already inside the house. Why were Lena and Ina Stillinger in the Moore house that night? This question would obsess investigators for years. 12-year-old Lena, responsible and mature for her age. 8-year-old Ina, described by teachers as perpetually cheerful. Their parents had expected them at their grandmother's house, but after the church program, Sarah Moore made that fateful invitation. The girls called their mother for permission. Think about that phone call. A mother saying yes to a sleepover. An ordinary parenting decision on an ordinary Sunday night. The girls were found in the downstairs guest room, the first room Ross Moore entered. Unlike the rest of the family upstairs, Lena showed defensive wounds on her arms. She'd fought back. She'd tried to protect her sister. What Ross Moore and Mary Peckham walked into that morning defied comprehension. Every victim had been killed in their bed. The weapon, Josiah's own axe, was found wiped clean, leaning against the wall of the downstairs bedroom. But it wasn't just the violence. It was what happened after. The killer had covered every mirror in the house with cloth. Every window had been blocked, some with clothing, some with fabric torn from the scene. A plate of untouched food sat on the kitchen table. Most disturbing, a slab of bacon, removed from the icebox, unwrapped, never cooked, lay next to the axe. The medical examiner placed the time of death between midnight and 2 a.m. All victims except Lena Stillinger appeared to have died in their sleep, killed with the blunt side of the axe blade. Here's what investigators missed. The killer had taken time, incredible amounts of time. After murdering 8 people, they'd moved through the house methodically, creating their bizarre scene. They'd even locked the doors from inside, then likely exited through a window. Who does that? Who stays in a house with 8 bodies and calmly covers mirrors? The axe belonged to Josiah Moore. Investigators found it exactly where the killer left it, cleaned of fingerprints but not of blood. The handle showed cuts and gouges consistent with repeated impacts against ceiling and walls in the narrow rooms. But here's the detail that changes everything. This wasn't the only axe. A second axe, belonging to the Moore family, remained untouched in the shed. The killer had specifically chosen Josiah's personal axe from inside the house. They knew where to find it. Modern forensic analysis of crime scene photos suggests the killer was left-handed. The angle of impact, the position of bodies, the swing patterns all point to a dominant left hand. In 1912, Iowa, only about 10% of the population was left-handed, and many were forced to use their right hand in public. Remember this detail. It matters. The killer's post-murder behavior tells us more than the murders themselves. Every mirror. Think about that. In the darkness, after committing the worst mass murder in Iowa history, someone walked room to room, covering every reflective surface. Mirrors covered with bed sheets, windows blocked with clothing, doors locked from inside, lamps found with chimneys removed, bloody water in wash basin. The killer had washed, not thoroughly. Blood remained throughout the house, but they'd attempted to clean themselves. Modern behavioral analysts classify this as restorative behavior, the killer trying to undo or hide from what they'd done. But in 1912, investigators saw something else: ritual. One detective noted something everyone else missed. The positioning of the bodies had been adjusted post-mortem. Bedclothes pulled up, victims arranged more peacefully. The killer felt remorse, or wanted to appear that way. But there's one more detail that investigators in 1912 couldn't have known was significant: the bacon. In several other unsolved axe murders across the Midwest between 1911 and 1912, investigators found food removed from ice boxes left at crime scenes. We were dealing with something bigger than one night in Villisca. If you want to understand why this case was never solved, you need to understand what happened to the crime scene. Before noon on June 10th, over 100 people had walked through the Moore house. 100 people. They touched evidence. They moved objects. They took souvenirs. Yes, souvenirs from a mass murder scene. Iowa didn't have a state criminal investigation unit in 1912. The Montgomery County Sheriff had 3 deputies. The National Guard finally arrived to secure the scene, 8 hours after discovery. 3 different private detective agencies would eventually investigate. They didn't share information. They actively sabotaged each other's investigations, each hoping to claim the reward money, which grew to over $3,000. To put this in perspective, the John Benet Ramsey crime scene, famously contaminated by today's standards, had fewer than 20 people enter before being secured. Villisca had over 100. Any physical evidence, fingerprints, footprints, trace evidence, was obliterated within hours. But the suspects that emerged, they'd haunt this town for generations. Frank Fernando Jones looked perfect for it. Iowa state senator, prominent businessman, and Josiah Moore's former employer turned bitter rival. Here's the connection. In 1907, Josiah Moore left Jones's Implement Company to start his own competing business. He took the John Deere franchise with him, the most lucrative contract in the county. Jones lost what would be $300,000 in today's money every year. But it gets darker. Investigators discovered Jones had been involved in an affair with Sarah Moore years earlier, before she married Josiah. The theory: Jones hired a killer, specifically William Blackie Mansfield, a suspected serial killer with a history of similar crimes. Except Jones had an alibi. He was in Cedar Rapids, 60 miles away, verified by multiple witnesses, unless he hired someone to do it. Private investigators found Jones had sent a telegram the day before the murders. The recipient's name was blacked out in records. The content never recovered. Jones was never charged. His political connections ran deep, but until his death in 1942, half of Villisca believed Frank Jones orchestrated the Moore family murders. Of all the suspects, Reverend George Kelly remains the most disturbing. Traveling preacher, Presbyterian minister, and on the night of June 9, 1912, George Kelly was in Villisca. He attended the Children's Day program. He watched the Moore children perform. He knew they'd be walking home in the dark. Kelly was left-handed. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. In 1917, 5 years after the murders, Kelly showed up at a pastor's house at 5 a.m. crying. "I killed those 8 people in Villisca." Kelly provided details. He said God told him to slay utterly. He described positioning of bodies never released to newspapers. He knew about the covered mirrors, the bacon, details only the killer should know. Then he recanted, said the confession was coerced, said he'd read about the details in newspapers, except investigators found those details were never published. Kelly went to trial twice. The first ended in a hung jury, 11 for conviction, 1 holdout. The second trial, with a change of venue, acquitted him. Later, investigation revealed Kelly had been institutionalized for peculiar behavior in 1914. He'd been arrested as a peeping Tom multiple times. He had a history of watching families through windows. Kelly left Iowa immediately after acquittal. He died in 1951, never confessing again, but he'd sent letters, dozens of them, to newspapers, to investigators, to the Moore family's relatives, always denying guilt, always knowing too much. Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the victims, represents the serial killer theory. Between September 1911 and June 1912, at least 10 similar axe murders occurred across the Midwest: Colorado Springs, Monmouth, Illinois, Ellsworth, Kansas. The pattern was specific. Entire families killed in their sleep. Axe found at scene, usually cleaned, mirrors covered or windows blocked, lamps with chimneys removed, food items disturbed. Henry Moore was convicted of killing his mother and grandmother with an axe in December 1912, 6 months after Villisca. But investigators found something extraordinary. Moore had been in every single town where these murders occurred, working as an itinerant laborer. The chances of one person randomly being in all these locations at the right times, less than 1 in 10 million. Moore was left-handed. He worked alone. He specifically targeted families with young children. In 1913, from the prison, Moore wrote, "I will stand a judgment for the lives of more than my mother and grandmother." He was never charged with the Villisca murders. He died in prison in 1956, taking any confessions with him. Remember, the Stillinger sisters weren't supposed to be there. William Mansfield, also known as Blackie, worked for Frank Jones. Private investigators discovered Mansfield had a criminal history, including a suspected axe murder in Illinois. The theory: Jones hired Mansfield to kill Josiah Moore, just Josiah. A business assassination. But Mansfield arrived to find a house full of children. Maybe he panicked. Maybe he couldn't leave witnesses. Maybe something darker drove him. Detective James Wilkerson spent 2 years tracking Mansfield. Found he'd been in Villisca the week before the murders. Found he'd left town on the earliest train the morning of June 10th. In 1916, federal investigators took over the Mansfield angle. They discovered he'd been arrested for similar crimes in 3 states, each time released on technicalities or lack of evidence. But here's what sealed Mansfield's potential guilt for many. His wife told investigators he came home the morning of June 10th covered in blood, said he'd been in a fight, burned his clothes. She recanted her statement 1 week later, said investigators threatened her. Mansfield was never charged. He disappeared in 1920. Some say he fled to Canada. Others believe Frank Jones had him killed to prevent him from talking. In 2019, forensic scientists applied contemporary analysis to the Villisca evidence. Using crime scene photos and dimensional analysis of the house, they reconstructed blood spatter patterns. Their findings challenge the original investigation. First, the killer was likely 5 feet 2 inches to 5 feet 6 inches tall, shorter than average for 1912 men. The ceiling impact marks and spatter angles confirm this. Second, the murder sequence was different than investigators believed. The parents died last, not first. The killer started with the children upstairs, then the Stillinger sisters, then the parents. This suggests the killer specifically targeted the children. The parents were eliminated as witnesses. People ask, why not test for DNA? The axe still exists. It's in the Villisca Historical Society, but it's been handled by thousands of people over 112 years. The house has been open for tours since 1994. Any biological evidence is hopelessly contaminated. Modern geographic profiling suggests the killer lived within 3 miles of the Moore house. They knew the family routine. They knew the house layout. They knew where Josiah kept his axe. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit reviewed the case in 2008. Their profile: white male, 25 to 35 years old, left-handed, religious background, experienced severe childhood trauma, likely killed before and after Villisca. 508 East 2nd Street stands frozen in time. The house operates as a museum and, controversially, as a paranormal investigation site. Over 10,000 visitors annually pay to walk through those same rooms. Darwin and Martha Lynn bought the house in 1994, restoring it to exactly how it looked that night in 1912. The same wallpaper patterns, the same furniture placement, even replica axes in the same spot. The paranormal claims are extensive: voices, moving objects, shadow figures, children's laughter. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the psychological weight of the space is undeniable. In 2014, a visitor named Robert Lawson stabbed himself inside the house, claiming spirits told him to do it. He survived, but sued the owners, saying they should have warned him about the house's dangerous paranormal environment. There's something unsettling about tragedy becoming tourism. 8 people, 6 of them children, died horrifically in those rooms. Now it's a destination, a bucket list item, an Instagram location. The house generates over $200,000 annually for Villisca. The murders, in a dark economic irony, became the town's most valuable asset. After 112 years, why don't we know who killed the Moore family? Start with the contaminated crime scene. No forensic evidence survived the first day. Add jurisdictional chaos. City police, county sheriff, state officials, private detectives all working against each other. The reward money created false confessions. At least 15 people confessed to the murders. Most couldn't even accurately describe the house layout. Frank Jones's political connections ran deep. He was never properly investigated. Files went missing. Witnesses changed stories. The lead investigator was removed from the case after suggesting Jones's involvement. But ultimately, it comes down to this: the killer was either incredibly lucky or incredibly smart. They chose the one night the Stillinger sisters were there, suggesting they didn't know, meaning it wasn't carefully planned. Or they did know, meaning someone very close to the family was involved. They left no fingerprints in an era before anyone knew to look for them. They disappeared into a pre-automobile rural landscape, where a stranger walking would draw attention, yet no one saw anything. Frank Jones died in 1942, maintaining innocence. Reverend Kelly died in 1951, never confessing again. Henry Moore died in 1956 in prison. William Mansfield vanished in 1920. If any of them did it, they took the truth to their graves. The case remains officially open. The Villisca Police Department still accepts tips. In 2020, they received 47 credible leads. None led anywhere. 8 people woke up on June 9, 1912, expecting another day. Parents worried about bills and business. Children thought about summer plans. 2 sisters excited about a sleepover. Herman Moore, 11, Catherine Moore, 10, Boyd Moore, 7, Paul Moore, 5, Lena Stillinger, 12, Ina Stillinger, 8. They deserve more than becoming a ghost story, more than their house becoming a tourist attraction. They deserve the truth. But after 112 years, 2 world wars, and the death of anyone who might have known, the truth of what happened in Villisca may be the one thing we can never recover. The covered mirrors, the bacon, the locked doors, every piece of evidence points in different directions, toward different suspects, different motives, different kinds of darkness. Maybe that's the real horror of Villisca. Not that a killer got away with murdering 8 people, but that in a town of 2,000 people, where everyone knew everyone, nobody truly knew who was capable of this.